Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer, and today we're here for another one-on-one video. And today we are one-on-one with
Pili Meyer.
Pili Meyer has been a real estate broker in Port. Have you been in Port Angeles your entire career?
Mm-hmm.
For how many years?
32.
And a very successful, not only real estate broker, but real estate instructor. In fact, Pili has been one of Washington Realtors' most favored real estate instructors for decades, really. And so we're very fortunate today to have her with us for this one-on-one, because one of the classes that you have taught, and I think you might be the only instructor in Washington State. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but you are certainly the best instructor in Washington State. With respect to the buyer agency agreement, please don't turn off your computer because I just said the word buyer agency agreement. Buyer agency agreements, though, are kind of I would almost say brokers have a phobia about using buyer agency agreements. They are certainly a less favored form of agency agreement or even form period in our forms toolbox. Would you agree with that?
I would.
And so my experience with the buyer agency agreement is when I teach classes where the buyer agency agreement comes up, I'll often ask the class membership to say, raise your hand if you use buyer agency agreements as a regular part of your practice. And no doubt, less than 10% of the hands in the classroom, wherever I am in the state, whatever level of experience broker I'm dealing with, less than 10% of the hands in the classroom will go up. But equally true is that when I then follow up with a question, for those of you who just raised your hand, would you say that using the buyer agency agreement makes your real estate practice more successful? I mean, heads go like this. I mean, it's undoubtedly they're affirming that statement that the buyer agency agreement is a valuable tool, and they wouldn't practice without it once they learn how to use it. Mm-hmm. Is that your experience also?
Yes.
Okay.
And I have two anecdotes for you.
Okay.
The first is that when I ask that question, a lot of the time I'll get the new-ish realtor, and he or she will say, I used to use them all the time until one of the veterans in the office told me not to because they don't work. I'm like, what? But they had no baggage relative to the buyer's agreement. It was a form, so they used it, and they got it signed. They had no problem. So where's the problem? It's in your head.
Crazy.
Bizarre. So another student I talked to said that she didn't want to use them because buyers would run screaming from the room. So that's where it resides, is between your ears. And she had been working with this couple every weekend for 6 weeks to show them properties. They were from out of town. And on a Monday, she went into the bank and saw them sitting at a loan officer's desk. And they were so excited, they came running over to her. After we left you yesterday, we went to an open house and we just loved it and we bought it. And she said she wanted to run screaming from the bank. So the lesson is she wasted all that time because she was afraid of being rejected. And you're afraid of being rejected because you don't know how to present it.
Okay, so let's boil this discussion down. And I think we're going to need more than one video to have this discussion. But for the purposes of this video, with the purpose of this video being to highlight the reasons why brokers might want to start using the buyer agency agreement, and in future videos we'll talk about some of the other issues related to buyer agency agreements, but focusing on why a buyer agency agreement is a valuable tool to a broker, can we look at maybe 3 issues to discuss today?
Sure.
Mark, does it help? Could it ever help a broker market their own business?
Yes.
Okay. Could a buyer agency agreement help in any way with like time management?
Absolutely.
Okay. What about protection of compensation? Does a buyer agency agreement help with that?
It's kind of like the bottom line of the whole thing.
Okay. So starting with marketability, let's start there.
Okay.
How does a buyer agency agreement help a broker market themselves to a buyer?
Well, as you said, fewer than 10% are using a buyer's agreement. And so we're always looking at ways to make ourselves different from everybody else, to step out, to get in the spotlight. And this is a great way to do it, because you're presenting in a more formal, more organized fashion the services that you're going to provide to the buyer, and you're asking for the buyer's commitment. And you are able to market yourself as someone who will represent buyers fully, etc.
Okay. Okay. Do you find that when you've used it, are buyers intrigued by the notion? That, I mean, do buyers recognize that you're something different than other buyer brokers when you pull out a buyer agency agreement?
Well, this is from a role play in a class.
Okay.
The agent pulled out the buyer's agreement, and the buyer said, "No one else has asked me to sign this." And the agent responded, "This is not a new concept, but it's one that many agents aren't willing to step up to." I thought that was fantastic. And you're not disparaging other people. You're just saying, this is out there. Not everybody's willing to do it.
Well, okay, so what I think you need to reframe that, because
Okay.
when I hear you say that to me, I will say it was a little off-putting to say, but not everybody's willing to step up to it. What does that mean how would you reframe that from buyer broker to buyer? How would you reframe that?
I'm signing this agreement, and I'm committing
Oh, there you go.
to do all this work for you. Not everyone is willing to sign that kind of commitment.
Okay, there you go. So
That's the elegant version. The other was the street version.
okay, I think a lot of brokers, industry members, view the buyer agency agreement as a really one-sided agreement where the buyer is agreeing to pay compensation and that's it. And that's why it's hard to think about getting a buyer to sign it, because all of the buyer agency agreement is about is, buyer, you're going to pay compensation.
Thank you. There has to be something in it for the buyer, or
Okay.
why would they sign it?
Okay.
And I've had this argument with back when Washington Realtors had their forums, and I've had this argument on the statewide forums task force, and saying there has to be some reason that the buyer says, okay, I see what's in it for me.
All right, so we don't have that reason in the boilerplate of Form 41A, right?
Yeah, right.
How do you create that incentive then to make a buyer want to sign? Why does a buyer recognize when Pili Meyer presents the buyer agency agreement that there's a lot of value for the buyer to sign the buyer agency agreement?
Because there is a written list of customer services. There's written things that I say I'm going to do. And
Written where? Because it's not written in Form 41A.
I use an addendum.
Okay.
Where
you add an
yes.
addendum to the Form 41A.
Yes.
Okay. Tell me about that addendum.
It says that I will do the following things for the buyer's agreement, for the buyer, and including things like, when possible, present the offer directly to the seller and the listing agent. And I know if people were ready to turn this off when they heard buyer's agreement, this is going to kill them. But frankly, and I know that there are some sellers who genuinely don't want this.
And listing agents.
It's more listing agents who don't want it. But why? I think that I can explain the buyer better and what their whatever. I can do a better job of presenting it than the listing agent can.
Okay.
Even fairly and as objectively as possible, but still so that the right points are made. Whereas
Okay.
I can't trust.
Okay, so one of the things you put in your addendum is that when possible, you'll present the offer. What else do you put in that addendum?
That when they're ready to write an offer, when they're narrowed it down to the house, I'll do a quick market analysis on that house. So they will feel more, there always is a because for each one of these. Because you will feel more secure about the offer you're writing, even if it has to be above full price.
Okay, all right.
And so each one of these things that you do, first of all, look at your market. What's the buyer concerned about? What are they worried about? That they may have to pay more at closing than they were ready for? I will get you those closing costs ahead of time.
Okay,
So you won't be surprised.
all right.
Those kinds of things.
Okay, we might talk more about what those things might be in a future video.
Okay.
All right, so that's how you see use of the buyer agency agreement to set yourself apart from other brokers in your community.
Yes.
Nobody else is doing it. Buyer, I'm willing to commit. I'm not just asking you to commit to me through this buyer agency agreement, but here's what I'm willing to commit to you through the signing of this buyer agency agreement. Okay.
And then you sign first.
Okay. All right. That's the marketing component of it. You said that there was a time management component of it.
Well, we're all busy, and we actually have personal lives too. So you walk in the office on a Monday morning, and maybe you had an open house, or maybe you just did a lot of fun things over the weekend, and it's kind of like, okay, what do I do today? And when I have signed buyer's agreements and signed listings, that's where I work first. If I have anything in closing, then of course that gets first attention. But then for the signed clients, the people who have agreed to work with me, I go to them first, and I look up what's going on and so on and so forth. So I don't have to rummage around going, well, what do you think I should do today? It's an easy way of building your business plan.
Okay. All right. And then the third component we talked about was protecting compensation after spending those 6 weeks, like your first broker you described to us.
There is a paragraph in the existing contract that says this is how I get paid, and it has that much space. And I've always said to brokers, you don't need to fill all that space. It's because subsequently on the next page, which is a bad management of form, it says, I'm working with the MLS, and the listing office generally pays a selling office commission, and if it is equal to the fee I put above, you owe me nothing.
Okay.
But if it is less...
It's paragraph 8C in
8C.
Form 41A, right?
Right.
Okay.
But if it is less than what I said above, then you agree to pay the difference. So it's right there in black and white. It's kind of messy because it's not all in the same place, as would be nice.
It's not on the same page, but it's all the same paragraph.
Okay.
Just being a little protective of the
We
forms.
can quibble about that later, off camera. But at any rate, the point is that, so you're having this discussion with the buyer. You've already told them all you're going to do for them. And frankly, oftentimes they'll say, who pays for this? So, they realize there's value to what you're doing. And this is where you're going to talk about how you get paid. And it's, the first few times you do this, it's scary. But why wouldn't you get paid? And if you don't do this, if you're, I'm not going to let my compensation be held hostage by the negotiating ability of the listing agent. I'm going to negotiate my own compensation. I'm going to do it in such a way that 99% of the time the buyer doesn't have to pay it because it's covered by the selling office commission.
Okay,
But
so that actually leads us to an evolution in the industry, right? Because it's entirely possible that a seller could offer zero compensation to the selling office. It's possible that could happen.
I thought we were close to the banks figuring this out, and then we had the big recession, the downturn, and we had short sales and foreclosures and all that crazy stuff, and the banks absolutely were not interested in trying to figure out how to wrap the commission the buyer pays into the loan. The loan is only on the sale price, not all this other stuff. And if the buyer could wrap it into the loan, it might be more palatable. It's in the loan anyway, the way it is today, because if it's the selling office commission, that's paid from the seller's side. But where does the seller get the money to pay that? From the buyer.
Right.
So my point is that you have to figure out how you're going to work through that and not let the listing agent, be the one to negotiate that for you, but you have to explain it to the buyer. And there could be some circumstances in which the buyer doesn't want to do that.
For example?
For example, they say, no, I'm not willing to pay any money at closing.
Okay. Or what if they never had any intention of closing with you in the first place?
That is on the last page of the form where you're asking them, okay, sign here. And here we've gone through maybe even 45 minutes of discussion and all this stuff. And now they're telling me, but Uncle Henry, who lives in Bellingham, is going to write anything I buy because he's a realtor, and he's family, and so I have to go with him.
Okay, so part of the lesson then is you've wasted 45 minutes, but you haven't wasted 45 days.
Exactly. And another thing I've heard is, well, we can't actually buy now. We have these financial obligations we have to take care of.
But we would love for you to spend your weekends showing us around so that 2.5 years from now, when we're ready to buy.
Yeah, that's what I call a back burner buyer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to some degree, when we talk about protecting your commission, we're not just talking about the contract that you're negotiating, saying if the seller doesn't pay, the buyer's going to pay. In some respects, you're protecting maybe not even your compensation, you're protecting your time.
Exactly.
Where are you going to be spending your time? Because if we really have a seller who is paying 0% compensation and you don't have the buyer agency agreement, if the buyer's actually is intent on buying now and does right with you, there's no buyer agency agreement and no selling office compensation from the seller, then in effect, the broker's working for free, right?
That is a common misperception. That oftentimes brokers will tell a seller or a buyer, no, I work for free until closing, then I get paid. They're using their resources. They are underwriting. The broker is using the broker's resources to effect closing. So in effect, they're underwriting the transaction and they get repaid at closing.
So the broker is going into debt to get the buyer where the buyer wants to be.
And of course that's your choice if you want to do that. But if you want to do that, make sure you have solid gold buyers you're working with.
Well, and a agreement protecting your compensation on the backside, right?
Right.
Because what we're seeing with the evolution of the market is that we could have a well-intended buyer and a seller who's not paying selling office compensation. And if buyer broker, you don't have an agreement negotiated with your well-intended buyer and no selling office compensation from the seller, you're going to get to the closing table and you're going to have gone into debt in order to help that buyer realize their goal.
Do you know what that's called? That's called tuition. You have just learned another lesson in real estate school, and you probably won't do that again.
All right. Okay, this is a lot of content for one video, so let's call it here. I think it's a good idea. In the next video, I think it would be a good idea to hear a little bit about your philosophy as to how the value that the buyer agency agreement brings to the relationship between the buyer and the buyer broker. And then at some point, I think we should work our way towards a role play.
Okay.
Where you present the buyer agency agreement to me as the buyer, and brokers get to benefit from 32 years of experience in learning how to do that. Okay?
Sounds good.
All right. In the meantime, if you have any questions on this subject or any other, send an email to me. If your questions are about this topic, I'm going to make sure that I share them with Pili and get her assistance in answering the questions. But send emails to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.